Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Chad Lawson. I will tell you all about Chad in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment that we exert toward others. And when you do it from a leadership standpoint, you do it with a singular purpose of bringing people together. Welcome, Chad Lawson.
Thank you so much, John. I love it. Love it.
Great. Well, I want to tell everybody about you, and that is that you are a Steinway artist and composer, and you just have released a #1 recording, including your most recent release, You Finally Knew, recorded at Abbey Road Studios in London. Is that cool, or is that cool, folks? Chad's been featured on things like CBS Morning News, All Things Considered, and the Morning Edition, where I first became accustomed to. Today, we're going to talk about not only his music, but his podcast called Calm It Down. And we will talk all about that. So, Chad, it is a pleasure to have you. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you very much, John. I love what you're doing, and I love the whole theme about bringing everyone together around this.
Well, great. How did you come about creating the series podcast called Calm It Down? And to do that, there's an intro, and I would like you to read it because your voice is just so sonorous. So give us a taste of that, Chad.
I have to be honest, I was never a fan of my own voice. And so it's so funny. This is one of the biggest comments I get. All right, so I'm going to read you the quote of the podcast. How do we swim this ocean of life when we feel like we're constantly drowning? On my best days, I'm barely dog paddling just to stay above the water. Together, we'll learn to navigate the negative currents as we search to anchor ourselves in calmer waters. Join me each week as we learn to pause, breathe, and quiet our mind in this vast ocean of ups and downs in what we call life, as we calm it down.
Great. Beautiful. That's the theme of your podcast. So how did you come about to even do a podcast? You are a composer. You are a musician. What prompted you to do this, Chad?
Well, I really became familiar with podcasting years ago. There was a podcast called Lore, Lore, and the podcast is The History of Folklore. And it's made by a best friend of mine named Aaron Minke. And I just saw him do this fascinating thing. And so then we would do live shows together. And, we would do thousands as far as the audience and attendance and such, the seats. And it was just mind-boggling that people love to go and just sit and listen to these stories. And I always found that so fascinating. And so for me, I would play while Aaron would read the scripts. So fast forward, and I really, I do transcendental meditation. I'm very much into wellness, into mindfulness, into yoga. It's very, it's not just a part of my life, it is my life. Mm-hmm. And so I really wanted to study the marriage of music and mental health. Yes, music makes us feel good, but why? Like, what's going on, like neurologically speaking, when we listen to music? And so I really started searching for this. And I came across this most amazing study by Oxford Press and Harvard. And it said listening to calming music for 3 to 5 minutes raises what's called our BDNF levels, which is just basically a nickname for happy hormones. It's what makes us feel good, right? It's brain-derived neural function or something like that, I think is what it's called. But basically, like when you are having coffee with a friend, or when you're exercising, or when you go for a walk in the woods, you feel better. And that's what these happy hormones are. But the most interesting thing is music was the only passive activity. You literally could just lay there, hit play on some calming music, and begin to feel better. And the science was proving it. And so that just really fascinated me. So I really started down this rabbit hole of wellness and music and how it ties into each other. And then the pandemic hit. And so what happened is I couldn't tour. So all of a sudden I was grounded, but I still wanted to stay relevant with my audience, with my listeners. And I wanted to connect with them, even though I couldn't be on stage. So I just moved off stage and moved to a microphone and said, you know what? there's no better time than to try this than right now. Let me go ahead and go for it. And it'll be temporary. This will only be for 2 or 3 months or something like that. Then the pandemic will be done and we'll all be together again. Wow, was I wrong? But the interesting thing is it's taken on a whole life of its own, the podcast, because it's one of those things where I get emails all the time from people saying, your music is helping me through a most difficult time in my life, right? That's only been exacerbated with the pandemic. And now people are coming to this who aren't even familiar with the music. And it's like, I found your podcast and it's everything from suicide to sexual abuse that I hear from. I mean, it's really unbelievable. And, I'm over the 2.5 million downloads at this point. I'm getting about 60,000 listeners each week right now. And it's one of those things where it's like, it can't go away now. Right. And I love it. I'm so grateful for it. So that's really how it all came about.
Well, you do a masterful job of it. And I want to tease the audience here a little bit. I want to play a piece of yours. You are a pianist. And here's from your new album, Breathe. And let's see what's on. So we'll have some more coming up, but I wanted to give folks a taste of the kind of music you play, and because your speaking voice, together with your music, they have a melodic quality. You have a voice which is very sonorous, and it is calming. So. And I read that you actually, because you mentioned meditation, do you actually do breathing exercises when you perform? Tell us about that, Chad.
Absolutely. So if you think about it, when you go see a performance, 9 times out of 10, the performance is actually the last thing on your mind, because like we have this going from one thing to another constant, right? I have a tea in front of me. And so it's one of those things where it's like, oh, I really just want to go and just make a nice cup of tea. Let me finish what I'm doing. And then I'm going to go make this nice cup of tea. So now I've got this tea. And now I'm thinking about like, okay, actually, I need to be doing this, not even noticing, what the tea is. And so we have this tendency to like never be present in the moment that we're in. Okay. So what I begin to do is understanding this is I teach the audience a very, very simple, like 3 to 4 minute breathing technique to allow them to bring their mind to center to enjoy the performance. And it doesn't have to be my performance. It can be any performance. But usually when we go see something, we go out for dinner and maybe the meal was bad, or maybe the waiter was rude, or maybe it was just all off, or maybe it was great. And then we leave and we find the car. Now we're trying to find a parking spot. We need to get our ticket. We get inside. We're rushed. Are the kids okay? Do I need to call the babysitter? And so like all of these things. And so when the curtains open, you have your mind spinning on all these things. You're like, great. Yeah, lovely. Hey, let's go get something to eat. Oh, what do you want to do next? Right.
Yeah.
And so like we live in this life where like it's no wonder that we look back and we can't remember anything in our lives because we're not there for it. So if
that's such a good exercise. I love that, because some would call it, colleagues of mine call it the pause, but we don't. I love how you integrate it, and it's something in my executive coaching, if I work with someone who's going to be a speaker, I said, if you're one in a series of speakers, close out. Don't just jump in. Let the other person close out. Let the audience digest. Let them know who you are. It's exactly what you're doing. But I liked how you tied that together, Chad. It enriches the experience. Mm-hmm. So,
100%. Space is my favorite note, right? I did an album years ago called The Space Between. And if you have a note right here, and then the next note, it's what happens between those two notes where the magic actually happens, because you hit a note, the listener is hearing it, but it needs to resonate. they need to digest what they're hearing before they move on to the next note. And that's what life is. You have this space where like you have to allow things to take root, right? You don't eat the fruit from something that you just planted that day. You have to allow it to like be nurtured until all of a sudden say, oh, okay, I'm seeing where this is going, right? But having that space, having that pause, as you just said, that was perfect. Absolutely.
Yeah. That's great. I think a couple of guys, one was Mozart and another one was Miles Davis, that said, listen to this space. It must work. You know?
Yeah.
But you know, Chad, you tied it together. It is what life is. And that's how we don't live in point to point. It's getting there or going there or whatever. So that's such a powerful concept. So let's talk about your show. And you said you have a really strong bond with your audience, and people come to you with issues and problems and real struggles. So, and I love the titles, and we will put it in the notes, the Calm It Down podcast, so folks can see it from themselves. But one of your podcasts is called "You Are Not a Fish." So tell us about framing the topic of self-worth as "You are not a fish." Where did that come from?
It kind of came from comparisons, to be honest, especially like social media, right? So like we have this thing where like we're constantly rating ourselves on what other people's abilities or talents or interests are, right? And so like the idea of like, if you ask a fish, the greatest swimmer more than anything in the world, if you ask it to climb a tree, it's going to fail because a fish isn't made to climb a tree. A fish is not going to play the piano, right? I don't care like how big or how smart of a fish, it's not able to play the piano. And I think for me personally, what I wanted to let people know is like, you're beautiful, right? Like you can swim if that's your thing. You can climb a tree if that's your thing. But like recognize that like you are what you are, and like that person, that thing is what it is, and be grateful for that, you know? Yeah, so I just love the idea of like you're not a fish, you know.
That's good. Well, your titles evoke something that one isn't going to expect from a self-help video. I mean, excuse me, a podcast. And so it's so different. There's another one you have where I think you got the idea from a musical group, Pink Floyd, say, what does it mean to be comfortably numb?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. The reason why I named them these, and the whole purpose, Calm It Down has two main elements that I try to keep at every focal point. Number one, that it's lighthearted, that it's encouraging. There are a lot of self-help or mental or emotional podcasts that I feel heavier after listening to it. And so I didn't want that. I wanted this to be very simple, very lighthearted, very humorous. I have a very dry wit banter as it is, and so it works perfectly with this. And the other thing is I wanted to be like one or two takeaways from every episode to where the listener could focus on that for the week moving forward. Instead of like, here's a podcast. Okay, cool. Well, what did you learn? I don't know. It was kind of just made me feel good. Yes, but what can you take away from it? So what is the takeaway? So for instance, with Comfortably Numb, David Gilmour is my favorite guitarist in the entire planet because he's so tasteful in how he plays. It's not about the ability, it's about the melody, and I'm a melody driven person. But going back to this episode, like I wanted it to be something that people were familiar with. You know, it's like, oh, Comfortably Numb. Well, that's a Pink Floyd tune. I'm really curious what he's going to talk about with us. And with Comfortably Numb, if you look at the history of The Wall and if you read about it in the book, like basically what he was struggling with, what Syd Barrett was struggling with, is he created this fictitious person for The Wall that was pseudo him. And what he had found is like he would do things to protect themselves, right? Boundaries are necessary. We need boundaries. But the problem is like when we get so obsessed with boundaries that all of a sudden we find ourselves like not able to see what even over our eyes. And so we're just like, whoa, okay, I'm numb to like everything right now because I've closed everything off. And so we have to find this balance of being able to say, okay, what's a boundary that is going to be helpful, and what's a boundary that maybe we need to like try to work through, right? Or try to like sit down with someone and say, hey, can you help me with this? Because I need some help. And so that's really, you know, there's another one called Driver's License, which is the Olivia Rodrigo song. And that was so fun to write about because it was my letter to her. Because if you listen to the lyrics of Driver's License, it's talking about, you know, this boy that she liked goes after another girl, right? And so she's like kind of complaining about it. And in the episode, it was like a note that I wanted to just slip to her as we're getting coffee of just being like, hey, just love yourself. You know, you've got to be able to like be okay with who you are before you start chasing someone who doesn't see who you are. Right. That's really hard. I mean, like it sounds so simple. We're all like, oh yeah, we know that. But like how often do we actually apply it?
Well, it is very simple, and we've heard it a million times. And because it's so simple, we forget it and don't act upon it, or it doesn't apply to me, it applies to you. And so there's another one you have called calming the mind, which I might venture to guess is kind of a sub theme in maybe all of your work or at least in your podcast, but it's just getting in a state where one can be receptive. Is that valid, Chad? So
10,000%. Exactly. So, I mean, the whole purpose of calming the mind is to be able to like, oh shoot, I wish I had it with me. A lot of times when I travel and when I speak, I go with a snow globe. And it's this snow globe of Snoopy, right? And so you shake it up and you see all these snowflakes. Well, all those snowflakes, those are our thoughts that we have every day. We have at least 50,000 thoughts every single day. Most of them are the same ones. The same things are like self, you know, critical and just everything that we're going through. And so what we're trying to do is we're not trying to ignore the snowflakes. We're just trying to not make snowballs out of them. We're trying to notice them and be like, okay. And if you get to the point of then naming what those snowflakes are, there's so much power when you name something, because at that point, case in point, I'm in my studio right now. Over there is the entrance door. If there was a knock on the door, I wouldn't know who it is. And so I could sit here and I could say, there's a knock on the door. I don't know who it is. Should I answer it? I don't know. They're knocking again. They're trying to get in. Whereas if I went over and if I opened the door and be like, oh, it's my son. I'm not going to say his name because I prefer not to. But it's just like, oh, hi, so-and-so, right? And it's like, at that point, you're familiar. You've been able to name it. And you're able to say, hey, you know what? This isn't really the best time right now. I'm not ignoring you, but I'll catch up with you in a little bit. I need to finish this interview that I'm doing with the most unbelievable guy named John Baldoni. So, and then I close the door. And then I address it later. And that's what we're trying to do with our thoughts. Like if we just sit here and if we just like let that door continue to knock, anxiety builds, fear builds. But when we get to that point, we're actually naming whatever is knocking at the door, then we take the power, we have the control, and we can look at that snowflake and be like, that is anxiety of a past due bill. I'm not ignoring this past due bill, but I'm going to address it later. But I'm not going to be distracted by that right now because I'm having a conversation with John. So yeah, so calming the mind, it's that is the reason of what we're trying to do.
Well, now I want to try something. I want to play one of your piano solos from Breathe, your newest album, and it's called Letting Go. And then I want to ask you a question after we play it for a second here.
Sure.
Okay. Empathy. It's a topic that is top of mind in our pandemic and as we navigate. What does it mean to you and how do we cultivate it? Can we cultivate it, Chad? So.
Yes. One of the biggest things I've always accredited my career to is waiting tables. I waited tables for 15 years, especially in New York, right? So you had a steak in one hand, you have a promo pack in the other, and that was just the life of an artist. But the interesting thing that I learned is it's about taking care and accommodating people without them even realizing they needed something, right? So like if I'm waiting tables with someone, and I notice that their drink is low, my role is to refill that drink before they ask. Because if they ask, it's too late, right? So I'm trying to look at what their needs are without them addressing me in hopes of those needs being met. And so for me personally, that was the biggest education as far as like connecting with people, because you have 30 people at all given time with all different personalities, and you're trying to connect with them like in an instant, really quickly. And so I began asking myself, okay, what does that person need? And the funny thing is, I have really thick skin, like the thickest skin you'll ever mind. Like things just roll off my back.
Yeah.
And so I
Well,
would go to the front.
I'm glad you say that, because you have such a gentle persona that one would not say that to you. But shame on the perception. But I'm glad you mentioned that. So,
But I would go up to the front to the hostess and I would say, give me the difficult tables. Like the people that just come in just grumpy and they just hate life the second they walk in the door. And they're like, are you serious? I'm like, yes, because I want to know what's making them this way. And I want to try to figure it out. I'm a huge problem solver. I love to problem solve. Now, going back to your thing about empathy, we have to make sure that we understand what the difference between empathy and sympathy is, because there's a big difference between the two. I actually, about an hour ago, I was texting a friend. I said, hey, I'm going to be in your area this week. I would love to catch up and get a coffee. And they said, my grandmother died and I'm actually not in town. Exactly what you just said. Oh, that's sympathy. That is feeling sorry for someone, because you're like, oh, I really hate to hear that. Now, empathy is my then saying, hey, I'm really sorry to hear that. I'm here if you need anything, right? Because like I've experienced loss, as most people have. And so that's the difference between sympathy, feeling bad for someone, or empathy, which is like seeing it from their perspective of like, oh my gosh, I'm really sorry they're actually going through this, because I know that feeling. Now, how do we cultivate that? I didn't write a long text of all these things. You should do this, you should do this, you should do this. I literally just said, I'm here if you need anything. And I think that is like the one thing that people just miss. And I think that's one thing interesting. This is actually just now coming to me. I haven't even thought about this. During the pandemic, what was it that we all craved for when we were quarantined? And as an extreme introvert that I am, even I was like, man, it'd be nice to see someone right now and just like touch base and talk, right? But people don't offer that. And that, I think that's how you cultivate empathy, is you just go, tell me more.
absolutely. And that's a theme that what empathy leads to, and it's my theme of grace, is it facilitates connection. But it's just what you said. If I go up to you, if I see Chad, you tell me something, and I go up to you, okay, Chad, here's what you got to do. Boom, 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 boom. It might be advice, but you're probably not going to be receptive, because I'm talking at you, not to you. And I love the way you talk about empathy as being that, how can I help and be there? And I'm going to say, because I already gave you one theme in your show, which is calm it down. But I think all of your episodes have that empathetic feel. I'm here for you. Listen, and maybe it's right for you. So that's cool. So let's switch to the big project, or not big project, but important music, which is your roots, which is Breathe. How did it come about? How did that piece? Was that pre-pandemic, during pandemic? What? How did it come about, Chad? So,
Breathe was during the pandemic. So I wrote the album for Breathe. What year is this right now? I wrote it in 2022. And so we obviously recorded it. Wait, what year is this? We're in 23 right now.
We're in 2022.
I wrote it the summer of 22. We recorded it in October of 22, and we released it this year. So it usually takes about a year for the album to get out.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that album was meant for. It was kind of a follow-up from the previous album of You Finally Knew. You Finally Knew was written pre-pandemic, released during pandemic. And the interesting thing about You Finally Knew is there was a song on there called Stay. And again, this is pre-pandemic. Stay was one of those things where one day I was doing transcendental meditation, and I was sitting there and I was with my eyes closed, and it's 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the afternoon. And I was like, this is so wonderful. I just wish I could just stay. right here. Because like I was just like in such a happy place, and I was like, I
Mhm.
just wish I could not leave. I wish I could stay. And so that song was inspired by that, of like finding 15 minutes of whatever your stay is. And it could be reading a book, it could be seeing a friend, it could be knitting, or, you know, playing piano at a hospital, right? Like whatever your 15 minutes of stay, of like trying to like literally carve that out in your day, just to like rejuvenate, to lick the wounds, and then go back out into the real world, because we're not meant to be wrapped in a bubble feeling good all the time alone, just being like, oh, life is amazing. That's not what life is. Life is anything but that. Now,
Yeah.
breathe was the follow up from that, because obviously we were in the pandemic, and it was one of those things where it's like, okay, what did you go into the pandemic with that you want to leave when we come out of this pandemic? Right. And I think of what the pandemic, it's amazing that it took a pandemic for us to stop, to actually like ask ourselves, what kind of life am I living? It's a global pandemic for all of us to actually stop and
Yeah.
ask ourselves, wait, all of this stuff I'm carrying, like on the luggage on my back, do I really want to be carrying this around anymore? And why? And so breathe was an invitation for the listener, for all of us, to actually say, okay, I'm going to take all this stuff and I'm going to do a massive exhale. You just played a song called Letting Go. Because I think what a lot of people found themselves in the position during the pandemic is, it's like, yes, I have all this stuff. I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know how to like get rid of it. And so the album was the invitation, hence Breathe, of just saying, hey, you know, I'm going to walk you through this huge. If you think about the science of breathing, it's carbon dioxide. And the reason why we release carbon dioxide is because it no longer nurtures our body, right? The body can't make use of it. It needs fresh oxygen, which we bring in. But if we
Mhm.
hold that, if we hold our breath, what's going on scientifically, oxygen isn't getting to the brain. We get dizzy, we get lightheaded, and we begin to pass out. We we need to exhale that carbon dioxide because it's not nurturing to our system. The same thing with
Right.
life. Like, what things are we carrying that isn't really nurturing to us, and why are we still holding it in when it needs to be letting go? So the album was a vehicle for people to be able to release.
Beautiful. Well, it is a beautiful album, and I do want to ask kind of a technical question here. But you alluded to, and I don't know if you consider yourself, but I will. You are also very much a writer and a composer, and so they're two different mediums. One's the words, one's the music. What's the starting point for you? Is it? I think you said melody, but did I hear you correctly? What's your starting point, Chad?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's one of those things where people ask, and they're like, "What inspires you when you write music?" And I'm like, "Oh, don't ask this question because I'm going to ruin it for you. I
Okay,
hate to
next
burst your
question.
bubble." I'm not one of those composers that get inspired by a sunset or by like, you know, cake. Or like, I'm going to write a song for this flower. That doesn't, I've tried and it's just fallen flat. And I'm also not one of those people that write religiously every day. I have friends of mine and they are like 45 minutes every day I write. And it may be good, may be bad, but it's the habit.
Okay.
For me personally, I get a melody in my head, and then I get another melody in my head, and then another, and then another. And it gets to the point where like, okay, I get it. All right, hold on. And so I go and I sit at the piano and I take pencil and manuscript paper and I write the melody, just the melody, because the melody is the most important thing in a song, in my opinion. It is the songbird. When you walk down the street and you're whistling, you know, whatever it is, that's the melody that's in your head.
Yeah.
And so with this album, like I'm, you know, I spent about a year just devouring Henry Mancini, like Mancini,
Hmm.
because like in my opinion, in the most recent decades, he was by far one of the most beautiful melody writers. I don't know if that's such a word. And so that really had a huge impact on me. It was like, you know, with these melodies. And so, for instance, okay. So that would be a melody, right? And so, and then I would go through and I'd say, okay, well, what chords does that work with? And then I would begin doing the embellishments. But it all starts with melody. Melody is everything.
That's great. I love that, Chad. We are racing through this program, and I could go on a long time, but your time is valuable. So, as you know, Chad, I ask every guest a story about grace. Is there one you wish to share with us? So,
yes. I had to think about this one to be a little bit, because I mean, like, grace is every day. Grace is one of those things where it's like it's given to you without asking return, right? And it goes back to waiting tables in a roundabout way. But then the thought came to mind. I'm not a higher academia person. I'm a self-learner. I'm really curious by nature, and so if I want to learn something, I go and learn it. But I did go to Berklee College of Music for 2 years, and then I dropped out, much to my mother's chagrin. But during one of those times, I was taking a class with Livingston Taylor, James Taylor's brother.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I was a massive James Taylor freak, like in high school, and just like his music was a really big deal. And as a musician, I studied everything. I knew, who played on what album and this and that. And so Don Grolnick was his music director for many, many years. And I had aspired to be in that seat one day when Don Grolnick was going to step down or whatever. I wanted to be James Taylor's music director. And so so we're in this class with Livingston. All of a sudden, James Taylor walks in the room, and we're like, "Oh my God, it's James Taylor!" But then it was a small class. We're only like 6 of us in the class. But then everybody went back to their conversations. I'm like, James Taylor's right there, and like everyone's just like talking about their weekend. I'm like, what? And so I grabbed a chair. I went over and I sat next to him, and I said, "Hey." I mean, freshman year. So what? How old are you? Like 18 or something
18,
like that? Yeah. I was like, "Hey, I know Don Grolnick is your music director right now, but I'm going to be your next music director." And he just kind of chuckled, and he was like, he sat there for a second, and he goes, "Man, I can't wait. That is going to be so much fun. I can't wait. That's going to be awesome." And I'm like, what? And he was like, reach out to my management, send them some music, give them some ideas of what you are. And he's like, if it works out, man, I can't wait. It's going to be awesome. And I left that room on cloud 9, right? And so it's like, here you've got some kid who doesn't know jack about anything as far as even being a music director, much less for, someone like this. And he totally just took me, had no clue who I was, has never seen me since, totally took me. And this whole kid, he was like, you know what? I have an opportunity right now where I can brush somebody off and break them completely and just being like, whatever, kid. Or I can have a moment of kindness and of grace and say, you know what? I'm going to sow into this kid. I'm going to plant a seed, and maybe other people will nurture it, and he'll have to nurture it himself. But I'm gonna plant the seed. I'm gonna put a little bit of water on it. I'm gonna let some sun kind of go on this seed. And I love telling that story, because like you don't really get to see that side of celebrities, if you will, or of artists like that. Right. And that's something I've never forgotten, ever, ever, ever.
What a wonderful story. And while you may not have connected with Mr. Taylor since then, I'm going to say you did it in a way, because if my history is right, he was discovered, per se, in London, and he performed for Paul McCartney, and it may have been in the Abbey Road Studios where you recorded "Breathe." So. Small world. Cool. So, Chad, it has been such an honor to have you on today, and your new album is "Breathe." We'll put it in the notes, but how can people find you? So,
my website, chadlawson.com, or at calmitdownpodcast.com as well.
Yep. Okay. With that, Chad, we're going to go out and thank you.
Thank you, John, so much.